Okay, good.
So Isidoro, we could start in a minute or two.
Okay.
I looked, so I went in the other room where we have another computer, and I pulled up the YouTube live, and it had like a countdown. And so
yeah, John, I just started it, and John said it might take a minute. Okay. So.
And should we just wait for participants to come in, or we just?
We have participants in.
Oh, we do?
You just don't see them; they're hidden.
Like a count.
Okay, so we're all set with YouTube Live, so we're good on that, and you guys can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay. So welcome everyone to our panel. The topic of the panel today is trauma and coping. It's a faculty panel for Without Limits. And I'm going to introduce our first panelist. Christopher Jansma is the author of Why We Came to the City and the Unchangeable Spots of Leopards. She's the winner of the Sherwood Anderson Foundation Fiction Award, a Pushcart Prize, and the recipient of an honorable mention for the PEN Hemingway Award. He has written for the New York Times, the Chicago Quarterly Review, SYCVA, The Believer, Prayer Schooner, and Electrical Literature. His work has been noted and distinguished in the Best American Short Stories 2016 and the Best American Essays in 2014. He's an associate professor of English and the director of creative writing at SUNY New Paltz. He lives in Westchester with his wife and 2 children. And Christopher is going to talk about trauma and the hunger winter, lessons for the 21st century. So, Christopher.
Okay, thank you so much, Isidoro, and thank you to everyone who helped put the panel together. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's known as the hunger winter, and I'll explain in just a moment what that is. Let me share my presentation here. I have to remember how to start this in. Yeah, let's see. Yeah. Sorry.
You go to slideshow and then from beginning. Yeah.
All right. Okay. I can't get the slideshow because it's under the other screen. Okay. Hold on. Yeah. I'll get it. 1 second. Everybody, sorry for the technical glitch here. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about trauma and the hunger winter. My presentation is sort of based around my experiences as a novelist and a short story writer, and thinking about the ways that since the global COVID pandemic began about a year ago, I've been noticing a lot more often how I've been using different kinds of narrative techniques to help myself understand what at times seemed, very nearly inexplicable, and for all of us. So I have a video here that's not loading, but anyway, I'll just you guys are familiar enough, I think, with the images. Mass deaths, sudden, scary unemployment spikes, scarcity of food and supplies, learning to wear masks, living in lockdown, becoming accustomed to working and learning remotely, and then being, sort of socially distanced from one another and isolated, cut off from our friends and our loved ones. We've all had to adapt very quickly to a completely new way of life. And this has all been happening amidst protests against police brutality and racism, a pivotal and even deadly national election, summer firestorms in California, winter snowstorms in Texas, all around the country and all across the globe. People are dealing with whole new levels of stress and anxiety and trauma right now. And we like to say that we're facing, quote unquote, unprecedented times. In many ways, that is true. But what I found this year was by speaking once a week to my 83-year-old grandmother. This is my grandmother. This is Oma. She is my father's mother. She was born in Holland in 1937. And she survived the end of World War II in Holland at the age of 8. And what I've started to kind of piece together through our conversations is that in many ways, these times are not quite as unprecedented as we have all been thinking. They may be unprecedented for many of us, but there are precedents in our history and in stories we're getting from passed down to us. As I said before, I'm a fiction writer. Part of the reason that I write is that I've found it to be a way for myself to mold the chaos and uncertainty of the real world into something that I'm able to manage or at least understand, perhaps even find value in or patterns of meaning in, and sometimes even humor in. Whether it's on the page or over Zoom or just in our own internal tellings of our lives, human beings use narratives to comprehend the incomprehensible, daily and minute, as well as sweeping and global. It can be a healing process both for ourselves and for others. Knowing the challenges that have been overcome in the past can help gird us for the challenges we're facing now. So as I said before, early in the pandemic, I began a series of weekly phone calls with my grandmother, Mika. She lives about 2 hours south of me in a central New Jersey retirement community. And she lives alone there. I'm physically closest to her in our family. My brother and his wife, this is our family photo, the last group picture I could find. My brother and his wife live in Texas. My parents have actually been stranded on a boat in the Caribbean since the pandemic began, which is quite a story, but I'll have to wait for maybe the next panel to get into. So it sort of came to me to keep calling and checking in on Oma. Every Friday, I would call her after I put my kids to bed and check in and make sure she was doing all right. And she would ask how my family and I were doing. And I would always, sort of reticently admit my wife and I were pretty stressed out. She had just started a new job and was worried that with this sort of sudden, scary economic downturn that she was going to be laid off. She worked in publishing, which is never really a very stable industry in the first place. And now, suddenly she was worried with bookstores closing and things like that, that she was, first in and might be first out. It didn't turn out to be that way, thankfully, but we were very worried. And then I was learning how to teach remotely, of course, as all of us were. Our two children, this is Joshua and Lila, 7 and 3 at the time the pandemic started. They were home from school indefinitely. Suddenly, we're trying to figure out how to juggle jobs, parenting, homeschool, supervision, buying groceries, sourcing Clorox wipes, toilet paper, hand sanitizer, and on and on. And every day was just feeling more and more stressful than the last. And of course, kind of in the background around us, we're watching the news and seeing things about ICUs filling up and ambulances going by our house at all hours with sirens blaring. And somehow, I remember in those early weeks that I wasn't really all that concerned for whatever reason that I was going to get COVID. We were staying indoors and we were being safe, and but my biggest concern sort of on a daily basis was just my kids and how they were handling the stress and reacting to my stress and my wife's stress. We weren't always able to be the best parents in the world with everything going on. And so, I kept sort of dwelling on this idea that they were going to come out of this whole experience sort of deeply scarred somehow. My 7-year-old son was acting out. He was tired of being stuck inside all the time. This was his face one morning here doing first grade on the iPad. He was missing all his friends. He would wake up 2 or 3 times a night in a panic and need one of us to climb in bed with him to calm him down. My 3-year-old daughter, Lila, had regressed back to using diapers. Was having hourly temper tantrums. And at one point she told my wife and I that she didn't go to school anymore because all of her friends don't like her. And we did not know how to explain to her what was going on and why she couldn't see her grandparents and all the other many things that she was suddenly kind of dealing with. I'm going to skip these two videos just in the interest of time, but this was an assignment my son had to do for school about his emotions, and his emotions that he was feeling were mad, sad, and done. And he made a little video about that. This is my daughter Lila talking about how much she misses her grandparents. We found some comfort in adapting our usual traditions. We did Zoom Passover with our in-laws. We started doing Zoom movie nights with our friends. This is pretty early in the pandemic. I believe we're watching Tiger King here on Netflix together. My friend Jill up here in the left-hand corner under the little sign that says "You are here." She actually has COVID in this picture. She is, I think, recovering pretty much at this point when this picture is taken, but we were checking in with her 2 or 3 times a day over Zoom. She lives alone in Brooklyn, and she had, high fevers, wasn't ever admitted to the hospital, but she was, we were worried about her. We drove down to drop food off for her and things like that at her building because she wasn't able to get groceries. And, we were checking in with her all the time to make sure she was, okay. So we were coming up with ways of, of excuses to see one another. Anyway, so as this was all going on, obviously, even with all the sort of the local personal stress, I realized that our troubles were really paling in comparison to the levels of trauma being experienced by lots of other people all around the country, parents losing work, people losing their homes, even many people dying of COVID. I was getting emails from my students every week explaining why their work was late or why they were having trouble keeping up with things. And oftentimes they would say that they were, had recently lost a relative or a friend or a friend's mother or something like that to COVID. And, through all this, my instinct was just to try to keep my head down and try to protect my family and hope that it would all just kind of, end soon. And I kind of told myself, as I'm sure many people did, right? That, a year or two from now, it's all going to be a distant memory. My kids will barely remember wearing masks, washing their hands 20 times a day. And life will just be back to normal, and it'll just feel like a bad dream. So one day I was on the phone with my grandmother, with Oma, and I brought this up, and she sort of warned me. She said, based on her experiences, I should really expect that, not only will my children remember, particularly my older son, but that there would be, some lasting effects that we should really be looking out for. And when I asked her what she meant by that, she started to kind of tell me a little bit more about her own story. I'd known broadly that between the ages of 4 and 8 years old, my grandmother had lived in Holland during World War II, and the country was occupied by the Nazis. What I knew about all this growing up mostly came from reading the diary of Anne Frank at school, visiting the Anne Frank Museum on family trips to Amsterdam. When I was a little boy, nobody told me that age that my own great-grandfather had been hiding from Nazis in an attic just like Frank's family, just a few hours away in The Hague. So just a little bit of background here. Because I think the kind of the history of Holland's role in the war is not often covered. Netherlands had pledged neutrality at the start of the war, but by May of 1940, the Germans had bombed the city of Rotterdam, and large parts of the city had burned down in the resulting firestorm. There's a picture of Rotterdam here in the upper right. It killed about 1,000 people, destroyed many homes and businesses. And the Dutch shortly thereafter surrendered because they were worried about the same thing happening in Utrecht over here. And the country fell under occupation. Just for a sense of scale, sorry, my little marker got screwed up here, but my grandmother's living here in The Hague, right on the shore, and Rotterdam is just down here. That's only a distance of about 25 kilometers, about 15 miles. So that would be, roughly the distance from New Paltz to Kingston. It only takes about a half an hour to drive from one place to the other now. So she was that close to, to the firestorm as a girl. from what she told me, at first, the first few years, she said she remembered the life under occupation was fairly normal. Businesses and schools were open. Many of the people that around her had most of their freedoms. But one of the big changes, one of the big things that was happening was that the Germans were firing rockets, V1 and V2 rockets at England from the beaches in Kijkdown and Scheveningen, which are sort of right near The Hague. And so this was not only sort of very scary to sort of live right near this. She told me that they would hear the rockets launching. They had to keep their windows open, or the panes of glass in their windows would shatter from the air pressure changes when the rockets went up. She said a couple of times the rockets would misfire and fall back into the city where they were living. She saw Allied planes coming to try to take out the rockets. They would get shot down in midair right over her street. This would all be when she was maybe 5 or 6 years old. She described seeing soldiers parachuting out of fallen planes and seeing bodies of soldiers and burning wreckage in the dunes near her house. Eventually, my grandmother and her brother Rob, her younger brother Rob, were sent to live in a town called Woerden, which I have sort of highlighted here on the map, in the eastern countryside with a host family that's actually closer to the border, but they thought it would be safer there. But eventually they had to return to The Hague again as the war went on and German restrictions increased. Steadily, the Germans began deporting more and more Dutch Jews to concentration camps. They'd eventually murder 70% of the Dutch Jewish population. It was far higher, according to historians at the Anne Frank House, a far higher percentage of Dutch Jews were killed than even in places like Belgium or France nearby. Meanwhile, any Dutch man older than 16 was being pressured to join the Waffen SS. This is a propaganda poster from that time, which she was then concerned about her father, who did not want to become a Nazi sympathizer, and in fact was involved with the local Dutch resistance. Which grew in response. Families like my grandfather's, who was living in Amsterdam at the time, was also a boy, were involved in underground efforts to help Dutch Jews flee persecution. But eventually the men that would not join voluntarily were rounded up by German order. My grandmother has a copy of the actual order, the piece of paper that was, sort of tacked to their door one day. I haven't been able to get it yet because I still haven't seen her in person in a year. But she's almost vaccinated, so I'm hoping very soon I'll be able to go down and actually get some of these things myself to see them in person. But anyway, at this point, Oma's father and several of the men in her apartment building were forced to go up into the attic and hide behind a double wall in order to avoid being arrested or shipped away. She said that they had one mattress that they had to share among them. This is probably, she remembers, 4 or 5 men, and a radio that they would listen to for hours up there for news about the liberation that they hoped was coming soon. In 1944, in the fall, the Dutch resistance sabotaged a major rail line to help prevent trains from embarking for concentration camps. In retaliation for that, the Germans cut off electricity, gas, and food to a large portion of the Dutch population during what was just about to become an unbearably cold winter. All in all, in the hunger winter, about 200,000 Dutch citizens would die of starvation and exposure. My grandmother now is about 8 years old. She says she remembers this period quite well. She remembers seeing stacked bodies of Dutch neighbors behind a building where they were being kept because the ground was too cold to dig for their burial. She remembers seeing schools, she remembers the Germans confiscating all metal objects, including her own bike and a family tea set. I don't know, those very particular things she remembers losing. One neighbor, she recalls, disassembled his own car and hid all the pieces in the woods so that the Nazis could not take it away. She believes he survived to reassemble it all afterwards. She remembers walking her younger brother Rob to a neighbor's house one day, and a Nazi soldier pointing a rifle at them when they were 8 and 4, roughly. So roughly the same ages as my kids. One by one, she said all the trees in the neighborhood were cut down in the night to be burned for warmth. People pulled apart the curbs on the street. I think this is what's going on in this central picture here. I'm not sure. She said they took the paving stones out of the street to get to the tar paper underneath, which apparently could be boiled and consumed. I'm still looking into some of these stories. I've since read a lot more about this, though. She said that according to one article I was reading, the rations that they had been allowed before the hunger winter were already a meager 700 calories a day per person. And then they were lowered to about 350 calories a day after the hunger winter began. And all throughout these archives I've been looking at in the online so far, you can see images like this one of very skinny Dutch children roaming around the city carrying spoons on the off chance that someone had a little extra food that they could borrow. She remembers this pretty well, having a spoon and you would kind of keep it in your pocket all the time. She described the clash between the steady threat of starvation, separate ever-present fear of being arrested or killed by German soldiers, or father being arrested. Some neighbors in her own building were known to be Nazi sympathizers and had to be avoided, and also kept in the dark about the men hiding in the attic. She said that there was a system they had in their building where they'd keep a broom by the fireplace so that if the Nazis came to raid their building, they would bang on the ceiling, kind of like inside the fireplace, so it would echo up to the next apartment above, and it would go up the chain. And she was on the very top of the chain, so on the 4th floor. Her job was when she heard the knocking that she would then scramble up to the attic to warn her father that and the other men that they had to, put up a wall and hide behind it. Anyway, she says as an 8-year-old, she said very, very clearly she felt certain that she was going to die. There was no gas, heat, electricity, or food. She remembers lying in bed, hallucinating due to hunger, believing at one point she said she had a dream that she was already in heaven, but she thinks she was just sort of hallucinating from lack of food. And she told me one story about an older German couple in her building who'd emigrated there before the war, and they were able to get extra food rations because they were former German patriots. And so it was, she said, thanks to this couple that they were able to share their food with her and her brother and other children in the building that probably kept them alive. She says that her guess is that if the war had lasted even another week, she and everybody else in the building probably would have starved. Happy ending. The Allies finally began to drop food on Holland in March of that year. She remembers people setting out all their best china at home on the table in anticipation of like a lavish meal being sort of airdropped in. And then she remembers going out with a pillowcase to the place where the planes were going to drop the food so they could gather up everything and bring it home. And then it turned out to just be a bunch of saltine crackers on the first round because I guess if you are trying to give food to people who haven't eaten in several weeks or months, then you can't just give them a pot roast on the first day. So it was just saltine crackers, she said, for a while, and then eventually bread and butter, and then eventually sort of, real food. She remembers finally going back to school again in September of 1945 and getting milk in cartons and oranges from the Red Cross for the first time. She'd never seen an orange before. She remembers biting into it like an apple with the whole peel on still. And she also remembered the care packages from America that they got at school included pieces of Wrigley's chewing gum, which no one understood because why would you give people who'd just been starving something that you had to chew but you couldn't actually eat, which I suppose is a good point. Anyway, what's astonishing to me is that, after all of this, Oma says that she really forgot about almost everything that happened through her later childhood and then into her teen years. She said people just didn't talk about it after it was over. There was this big rush to resume Can everybody hear me okay? Sorry, it looks like my signal is cutting out. Okay. But as we know, we can't simply will these things away. Trauma finds its way to resurface emotionally and physically. She said that the first real sign of any lasting impact from the hunger winter was in her teens. One day she just physically couldn't get herself out of bed, and she went to a doctor, and they found that she was severely anemic. And she had to go. She said 3 days a week for the rest of that year to receive iron shots to help her sort of recover. And by that time, she was eating, regular meals, and she was, surprised. But doctors told her that it was happening to a lot of other young women around her same age, and it's something due to link to the malnutrition that was now being kind of triggered. The previous malnutrition now being kind of triggered by hormones during puberty. She remembers also sort of emotional, post-traumatic stress. She remembers at age 16 going to see some fireworks at the beach with with my grandfather, who was then her boyfriend, and having traumatic flashbacks to the sound of the B-1 rockets going off around her. She gets emotional about it even now. One night as we were talking on the phone, she saw a story on CNN saying that Germany was taking overflow COVID patients from Holland. And she got very choked up by that news. Even though it had been 75 years since the end of the war, she was still like just very emotional about the idea that, now we're in a place where, the Germans are helping people in Holland. Of course, they've been allies for my whole life, but in her memory, it's very different. Anyway, I imagine many of you are thinking something like what I soon began to think hearing all these stories, which is, that compared to what she'd been through and the traumas of the hunger winter, my own family and I had relatively little to worry about by comparison. As it turned out, the lockdowns ended after about 12 weeks in our part of New York State. Since September, my kids have been able to resume partial school schedules. We haven't had to grapple with unemployment, thankfully. Our relatives are safe. We've seen, some of them in person again, even. The grocery stores near us are fully stocked with toilet paper and hand sanitizer. My daughters remembered how to use the potty. My son is sleeping through the night. They are now so used to wearing their masks at school, they forget to take them off when they come home at the end of the day. But of course, 2,100 people have died of COVID so far just in my county. Nationwide, we've surpassed 500,000 deaths. Around the world, estimates are that we've added as many as 150 million people to extreme poverty this year, and that we may see an additional 122 million deaths just from starvation in what Oxfam is calling the hunger virus. This is from an article in July of this past July. And maybe I'll wrap up here because I don't want to go too long, but when I was a boy, one of my earliest memories actually is seeing my grandmother, seeing Oma at her college graduation. She didn't have the chance to go to college as a young woman. She married my grandfather fairly young. They emigrated to America and started a life here. But once my father was grown and raising his own family, she enrolled at Brookdale Community College in my hometown. She was determined to get her degree. And when she was there, she studied creative writing, and she wrote for the campus literary magazine there, Collage. This is 1982. This is the year that I was born. This is a haiku poem that she wrote and published under her maiden name. She has 2 haikus in this issue. She still writes today. She sends me haikus that she's writing for her retirement community newsletter every month. But what she told me was that it was the first day of her creative writing class when her professor asked everyone to sit down and think about their earliest childhood memory. She said she closed her eyes and remembered standing in the kitchen, watching through the windows as planes flew overhead. She didn't know then that they were heading towards Rotterdam or what they were going to do when they got there, but she remembered her father saying to her, "De oorlog begint," or "the war is starting." And it was the act of writing that story down in the early 1980s that she says opened the floodgates of her memories and allowed her to begin to process what she'd lived through as a young girl. Understanding the narratives coming out of things like the hunger winter gives us strength to face our own challenges. Not knowing when things will get better or how can be devastating to our mental health and our ability to carry out our ordinary duties, let alone extraordinary ones. Talking to my grandmother during these weeks of peak uncertainty gave me a kind of comfort and confidence that I badly needed. I needed her survival narrative to help me construct my own. I'm going to stop there. There's a little sort of side note about epigenetics that I'm interested in also as it relates to narratives, but I don't want to eat up too much time. So I'm happy to talk more about that later if there is time. All right, thank you, and throw it back to you, Isadora.
Thank you, Chris. It's a fantastic presentation. It's very telling of the event and the experience that we are going through. And I want to move to our next panelist, Carla Mullen. Her title is Welcome to Adulthood. So Carla is an associate professor of psychology and a deputy director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health. She also oversees the Student Psychological Resilience Project, a new campus initiative which aims to destigmatize stigma around mental health issues and encourage well-being among students. Her research focuses on the impact of growing up in the post-9/11 disaster-filled world of today's emerging adults. That will be a subject of her third book, Generation Disaster, Coming of Age Post 9/11, which will be published in 2021 as part of the Oxford University Press Emerging Adulthood series. So without much ado, Carla, thank you for coming to the panel. And
Great, thank you. Let me just get my screen sharing. Come on. There we go. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see that. So thank you for that introduction, Isidoro. As he said, basically I have this kind of dual role at New Paltz where I work with the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, which a lot of our focus is more kind of external, doing trainings for disaster responders. So you can imagine we've been very busy since the pandemic began. We've trained so many different professional groups, including librarians and judges and home healthcare aides and everyone, because there's just so much recognition of the mental health impact of this pandemic. And I will say, if there's sort of any positive of the whole thing, it's maybe that this will lead to more destigmatization and more recognition that we absolutely need to pay attention to people's mental health. But my own personal research focus is more drawing on my background as an applied developmental psychologist. So since I started teaching and really started, bonding and coming to truly respect the challenges that our students are typically living through, I became really interested in this developmental stage of emerging adulthood. So that is basically considered age 18 to 29. It's a fairly newly recognized stage of life. As sort of lifespans have gotten longer, it's become more traditional for people to extend their time in school before beginning their careers, all sorts of other phenomena included in that. But now, there's sort of this acknowledgement that you don't just turn 18 and become an adult. There's this kind of transitional period of emerging adulthood. And that is really, really complicated. It was really complicated to begin with. So this book that I've been working on for the last several years is really, the kind of premise of it is that emerging adults today are so often vilified as being overly sensitive or entitled or the fragile snowflake kind of thing. And I think that's really comes down to an utter failure of older adults to understand the world that this generation has grown up in. So this generation started doing lockdown drills in kindergarten, literally, because of school shootings. That has always been part of their consciousness. Certainly just, natural disasters, all of the changes to society post 9/11, and then all the background stuff of climate change and all of the racial disparities and financial disparities and the pressure of student loans for those who have decided to make that investment in going to college, with which they've spent their lives being told is definitely going to pay off. And now they're recognizing for some people, maybe it's not, because of just that burden of having to confront the loan debt that they've been dealing with. And then of course you have social media, so you can't get away from this at any point. You know, it's so present for them all the time. The political polarization, the influencers on, you know, that impact on self-esteem, all of this stuff. Their lives were already really, really complicated, and now they're dealing with the impact of the pandemic as well. So what I'm going to talk about for the next few slides is sort of the pre-pandemic issues and pressures that they were already looking at, combination of external research and then some of my own research for the book. I will say, 1 year ago, I had finished everything but the conclusion chapter of the book, and then the pandemic hit, and it's like, okay, this is sort of based on current events. And so I sort of put my book on hold along with everything else to kind of see how am I going to incorporate this. So that was stressful on top of everything else. But anyway, I revived it over the summer. It's now in production. It'll be out probably in August. But some of the research that I was looking at for that was, again, this is pre-pandemic, just, you know, to understand the stressors on this population in general. So I'm sure it's no surprise to any of us that there have been very high rates recognized of mental illness. And in some cases that may be that those levels might have been similar in the past, but it was not okay to seek help, you know, because of those issues of stigma or lack of access to care. I think that's maybe something John will be touching on, is that's John Raskin, the next presenter. But you can see these really, I won't go through every one of them, you can read them, but really, really high rates pre-pandemic of serious mental illness, depression, and certainly then misuse of alcohol and either misuse of prescription drugs or use of illegal drugs. The opioid pandemic, you know, that's kind of this generation's issue as well. Also issues around anxiety. And even if that is not kind of clinical level, you know, diagnosable anxiety, still, even if that's only stress, you know, I thought this was a really revealing survey. This was a big one. I think this was, I don't know, 10,000 people or something, done by the American Psychological Association. And they were asking not just young people, they had different age groups with this, but, you know, what are they anxious about in daily life? And, you know, look at, you can see the different stressors. So politics, I mean, 2019, obviously that was a lot, you know, very much present for everyone. Family relationships, health, and again, health pre-pandemic, keeping people safe, and then the financial pressures. For every one of these, you know, they were saying that they were somewhat or extremely anxious, at least half of them, and up to 3/4 of them about these different factors. And tragically, horribly, that also, you know, all this pressure has led to this increase in, in suicide among this age group. Now, these are still from fairly low base rates. So even though the increase in percentages is horrific, especially for women, 93% between 1999 and 2017, we're still looking at fairly low numbers, but I think we can all agree any suicide is one too many suicides among this population. And looking at some of my own research, as part of preparations for the book in spring 2019, I did a Qualtrics panel of 1,000 emerging adults, so ages 18 to 29, skewed towards the older end of that. And what I very much wanted to do is get beyond, you know, one of the problems with research on emerging adulthood is that it tends to just focus on college students, and college students have a lot to tell us about their generation, but they are not the entire generation. So I very actively had them recruit a lot, you know, basically oversampling of non-college, including people who had not only were currently in college and had graduated, but for whom high school was their highest level of education. And it was also racially balanced and evenly split by gender. So in this 1,000-person sample, I asked them a whole lot of questions, but among them, one of the things I looked at was how concerned are they about disasters, about these kind of external threats. And you can see again here, we have pretty high rates. You know, looking at natural disasters, 22% not at all concerned. Looking at human-caused disasters, only, you know, less than 20% not concerned. and especially high rates of concern about climate change. And I think that just makes sense. I mean, this is the generation that is genuinely going to have to be dealing with the consequences that the older groups among us have passed on to them through our behaviors, and that we don't necessarily have to worry about having such direct effects throughout our lifetimes. So those were some of the disaster threat perceptions. I know I'm running through these quickly, but I want to get to the actual student comments. I also asked them a bunch of questions about their perceptions about just the world being safe and fair and just. And I think these are pretty dismal. 43% disagree that the world is generally safe. Close to 50% disagree that the world is generally fair, and more even distribution that people usually get what they deserve. But that's pretty upsetting to think about young people who are kind of at the beginning of adulthood having these really pretty dire perceptions about what they can expect from the world. And they've learned that from experience. This is not just them being overly sensitive. This is based on everything that they've grown up with their entire lives. So how is the pandemic going to feed into this? I think we can probably agree, not in great ways overall. And it's too soon to tell for sure. As Chris was just saying, it's going to take decades for us really to, or extrapolating from what Chris was saying, decades for us to really understand the lasting effects of this. But I think there's some stuff we can agree we're already seeing for sure among our students, among the young people we know and love and work with, or maybe those of you who have children in this developmental stage. But certainly those who are already grappling with mental health issues, a lot of them, it's a lot worse. And that's just because, everything we know, the disruption of routine, the inability to get the social support that we absolutely know is the most important thing for many young people, the most important source of comfort, the uncertainty, all of these issues. I think the first 2 points really apply to any age. The lost experiences. I mean, how many of us have talked to students last year who were graduating who didn't get their commencement ceremony? Is that the same as losing a loved one or becoming ill yourself and having lasting physical symptoms because of that? No, but if you've spent your entire life feeling like you're working up to graduation as that milestone, you can't replace that. And so figuring out how to just mourn those and then validate. And I think this is one of the things that's really complicated within the pandemic is everyone has had some kind of loss. Everyone has had some kind of stressors and missed experiences and difficulties. We recognize there's this huge spectrum in those. And so those of us who've maybe, not had it so bad feel really bad about complaining about things that can kind of seem small. But we have to sort of give people a way to validate that and recognize that those losses are genuine losses and that they have the right to be sad about them. And then, just this perception that things aren't going to go back to normal again, the normal that they expected. And for someone who is just kind of working up to those adult milestones, establishing a career, thinking about starting a family, buying a house, to think that that's going to happen in this changed world, that's really stressful at any age, but I think particularly for the emerging adults. So I wanted to really get to some of the writings really that I've collected from our own students. And a lot of this comes from students in my senior seminars, both last spring during, who I was teaching during the shutdown, and in this semester when we're all now in, the third semester basically of dealing with these conditions. So this is the capstone that I've been teaching on the psychology of emerging adulthood in today's world. So very much, on the topic of the book. But I've asked them explicitly to talk about their experiences. And I'm going to kind of interweave one sort of longer passage from a student who was in my class last semester. And she wrote this basically in the last week of the semester when she was finishing her senior year from her parents' house and not going to have the commencement ceremony. So she's very actually prescient about some of the lasting effects. I'm going to kind of intersperse that with some more recent, now that we are almost a year into it, reports from students. So I don't know, I think I'm just going to read this. I know reading and listening at the same time are not the best, so you can either shut your eyes if you'd rather hear it, or you can tune me out and read it for yourself. But so what she wrote back last May: the world that we knew before is forever changed. Society will be ever changed because of the pandemic. I think people will have PTSD after being in quarantine or until there's a vaccine for the virus. I believe people may be too afraid to go out to eat when we are told that the public world is open again, too anxious to open doors for others since we will be less than 6 feet apart from each other, and won't be able to give a stranger a smile because their face will be covered with a mask. I think she's dead on in a lot of these predictions. And then just looking at, some of these factors that are really specific to emerging adulthood, a lot of what I've heard from students is their concerns about the economy and their ability to get jobs as they are, finishing college and moving into their careers. So this was from a current student. I believe a great concern that my generation has is the setup for failure that's established by a capitalist society. We're expected to do so much with so little. It's even difficult to survive with most entry-level jobs, and we're discouraged to pursue any career path that does not guarantee successful, meaning comfortable, pay. The pandemic fortified this struggle by an extreme amount. People have lost their jobs, quit their jobs because of difficulties relating to the pandemic, and have lost opportunities that would have helped with their financial needs. This pandemic has been such a hindrance to people everywhere, especially emerging adults who are in a constant struggle regarding financial needs. And I'm sure many of you have heard this as well. I mean, even students, who lost the internships that they had planned, lost the part-time jobs they had planned. Now they feel like they're graduating without those things that have now become essential to have on your resume if you want to have any chance of getting a decent job in an economy where, unfortunately, a college degree has really become sort of devalued because it is the norm now. And then also, one of the big tasks of emerging adulthood is this idea of individuation. That sort of begins in adolescence, but it really kind of is, completed or pursued further throughout the process of becoming a genuine adult. And this is this idea of kind of taking the reins over from your parents and taking control of your own decisions, your own choices, the way that you want to live your life. It's not an instantaneous process. It can take a while. Some people accomplish it more or less successfully or on different timelines than others, but that is kind of a big thing that, is a goal. And this, I found this very upsetting. One of the biggest issues I believe my generation has had to deal with due to the pandemic would be living in toxic households. So much going on in today's households that people do not speak of. I myself have lived in a toxic household before college. These young adults have to live in homes where they're not happy nor comfortable. Going away to school has been an escape for most. An escape from domestic violence and abuse, trauma, lack of food. These young adults have to carry on the damage and trauma of their parents, but being at school can take that stress off and give them some privacy. This pandemic has made this issue worse. And I don't know how this is going to shake out for this whole generation, but just that kind of that backwards motion. Chris talked about his daughter losing her potty training skills. It's a kind of comparable emotional regression or just, ability to kind of pursue what we think of as you moved out, you launched, and now a lot of students are, and young people in general, are having to kind of reverse that process, which is not the norm and not a choice for most of them. Just a few more points, a couple more minutes. So back to my student from last year, some good things to look at are that March, so this would be March 2020, was the first month without a school shooting in this country for a while. Nature is slowly being restored, yet almost everyone I know my age is having a mental breakdown about either finding a job after they graduate next month or because they recently got laid off from their previous job. So again, just this deep concern about finance and the future. And, this is not fragility to me. This is a very practical concern being expressed because we've told them, you go to college so you can get a good job and the intrinsic value of an education, of course. And now that kind of rug has been torn out from a lot of them. So just a couple more slides to end on a slightly positive note, this idea of resilience and even post-traumatic growth. Chrysosoma clearly had a major resilience. Everyone who went through the hunger winter and survived did so due to resilience. So humans have an unbelievable ability to get through difficult things and to move on from them, and in some cases to take away positive messages. So this was another current student. The global impact of COVID made us human beings feel a sense of togetherness through adversity and with hope. In the wake of the pandemic, I hope to see my generation experience post-traumatic growth. I know we have limitless potential to form the most inclusive, unified, diverse, accepting cohort identity humankind has known if we can come together and heal first. And building on that, to just last point, to go back to last year's student, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this without choking up. I find this so moving, but I also think the pandemic will affect my generation moving forward in the sense that it will make us realize that life is so fragile and can be taken away from us at any moment. We will more than likely try to enjoy the moment more and be more thankful for our loved ones and friends once we can be reunited again. I believe this to be true since the pandemic makes you realize that love is the most important currency we have right now, since if we do not rise up together, we will fall apart. And at the end of the day, we just have to hold on to hope for a better tomorrow, since without hope, we have nothing. So I will give her the final word, but I just hope that lets us kind of recognize and appreciate that our students, yes, they are struggling. Yes, the pandemic is making things even worse on top of the massive stressors they already had, but they are tough. I mean, they are getting through it. They are resilient. And I think they really deserve our respect for that. So I hope that message will get through to everyone. Thank you. All right.
All right, thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. Kind of reflecting a little bit, reminding me of some of the conversations I had with many students in the last year, and everything ties in. Just a quick reminder, if people could mute their microphones, there seems to be an echo. So thank you, and I'm just going to move to the next panelist, and then we can have a little bit more minutes to have a conversation. And our next panelist is Jonathan Raskin. Jonathan Raskin is going to present the coronavirus in context, a guide for coping. And Raskin is a professor of psychology and counselor of education at the State University of New Paltz. He currently serves as the chair of the Department of Psychology, which houses the psychology undergraduate program and graduate program in counselor education and psychological science. In addition to his faculty work, Dr. Raskin is a co-editor of the Journal of Constructivist Psychology. He's also a licensed psychologist who maintains an active private practice. Dr. Raskin's research focuses on constructive meaning-based approaches in psychology and counselor education, especially their applications to understanding abnormality, counseling, and psychotherapy. Much of his scholarship builds on George Kelly's personal construct theory and Ernst Ben, I'm sorry, I'm gonna mispronounce that. Radical optimism. But he also incorporates social constructionism, narrative theory, solution-focused therapy, context-centered therapy, and other constructivist approaches. Dr. Raskin is the author of the textbook, A Normal Psychology, Contrasting Perspectives. Thank you. So go ahead and we'll just move on to your presentation.
Great. So I'm going to share my, and hopefully everybody can now see my slides. I apologize, Isadora, that my introduction was too complicated. So yes, I'm going to talk about the coronavirus in context, a guide for coping, and giving the two powerful but also upsetting in some ways presentations that we just saw. Hopefully this can provide people with a few ideas about ways to cope with what's been going on. And since I only have a few minutes, allow me to get right to the point. So I'm going to boldly assert some things about the context-centered approach to psychology and psychotherapy that I think with additional time, I could demonstrate more fully and convincingly. So for anyone who's a glutton for punishment and wants more theoretical exposition, I am happy to share with you the fuller paper from which these ideas are drawn. But with that said, let me dive right into explaining the basics of a context-centered approach to psychology and psychotherapy so that we can then apply it to considering the pandemic. So let's begin by defining contexts. Contexts are mental frameworks that are governed by presuppositions that set ground rules. And these ground rules establish psychological boundaries, not just for what you think and how you think, but for what you can think. And two common contexts that I want to focus on, I'm going to call the mind and the self. These are psychological terms that are commonly used in daily life, but here I want to define them in some very specific ways. The mind as a context frames everything in terms of safety and winning. It's everything defensive and self-protective about a person. In a nutshell, the mind is always looking out for number one. It cares nothing about happiness and satisfaction. Instead, it's focused exclusively on your protection and your survival. So the mind sees the world in terms of potential threat. It makes others wrong, it blames, it judges, and it operates in general from a self-protective stance. By contrast, when we operate from the context of self, we switch our focus from individual survival to connection and to relationship. The self understands that we're all in this together. It seeks human connectedness and interrelatedness. The self is non-possessive, unselfish, open, generous, accepting, and loving. And although we'd all prefer to operate entirely from the context of self, when we're under threat, we all have the capacity to shift into a mind-based defensiveness. And that's just part of being human. To operate effectively in times of real trouble, like the pandemic, it really helps to recognize and acknowledge the mind's perspective rather than trying to deny it or go around it. Only then, I think, can we fully add the input of the self. So while the mind is all about blame and avoidance, the self adds the essential elements of responsibility and community. So let's briefly consider some examples of mind-self contrasts and then relate them to the pandemic. The first mind-self contrast I'd like to introduce is something called blame versus true responsibility. So when your mind sounds the alarm, it indulges in one of its classic maneuvers. It declares itself right and others wrong. That's why it's no surprise that throughout the coronavirus crisis, we've witnessed a great deal of blaming. Right? Initially, President Trump blamed all the governors, and some of the governors returned the favor. Currently, we see lots of blame and recrimination over distribution of the vaccine. Of course, in instances like our mishandling of the virus response or our difficulties getting people the vaccine, there is a reality basis for the mind's accusations. After all, it's always easier for the mind to argue from truths or partial truths than outright fantasies. However, over the long haul, getting stuck in cycles of blame and recrimination does very little to advance the cause. So when you make someone wrong, you only motivate them to make you return. Now, the alternative to the blame game is what context-centered therapists label true responsibility. The self-based acknowledgement of the core role each of us plays in creating our experiential reality. Now, this isn't to be confused with times when people use the word responsibility as a synonym for blame, such as when someone hurls an accusatory, "You're responsible for this," at us. True responsibility isn't about being right or wrong, and it can never be foisted on us from outside. True responsibility is the simple acknowledgement that you are who you are and that you create your own unique experience of the universe. This form of responsibility is non-judgmental, and it doesn't imply that you should change or that things should be different. Importantly, drawing attention to true responsibility isn't the same as saying that people are responsible for their circumstances. We're often at the mercy of events that are beyond our control. So true responsibility, which is an aspect of the self, shouldn't be confused with blaming, an activity of the mind. For example, people of color who've been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic aren't truly responsible for their plight, to suggest as much as to unfairly engage in mind-driven blaming. True responsibility instead refers to our responsibility for how we experience circumstances, not to us being responsible for the circumstances themselves. Low-wage supermarket workers compelled to place their safety at risk out of economic necessity may be victimized by an oppressive state of affairs, but how they contextually make sense of themselves and their experience is something no set of circumstances can take from them. So distinguishing between blame and true responsibility, I think, can help us harness the power of self. For example, one 20-something sheltering in place at his mother's house resented her criticisms of his messy room and his erratic sleep patterns. This produced emotionally exhausting family feuds. However, when he came to see that these were just self-perpetuating right-wrong battles, pitting his mind against his mom's, he was able to back off and take a different role. Recognizing how much his unanticipated return home had upset the family routine, he promised to be a better house guest. And this lessened the tension enough for his mother to acknowledge that her son, who had lived on his own for several years, was now used to being treated as an independent adult rather than a child. Shifting gears, another mind-self contrast that I think can help us understand our responses to the pandemic is that of being at effect versus being at cause. In the mind's quest to avoid blame, it often portrays itself as the victim of overpowering circumstances, what context-centered therapists call being at effect. Problems and mistakes are attributed to bad luck, the perniciousness of others, or events beyond our control. Of course, we all sometimes experience ourselves as being at effect in connection with factors we don't like and didn't anticipate. For instance, a snowstorm, there have been a lot of those lately, that leads to canceling a favorite outing, or the loss of a job because of corporate mismanagement. The coronavirus is a particularly powerful at-effect event. Just about everyone feels victimized by it in some way. The danger is that when we consistently view ourselves as victims, our sense of self is diminished. We wallow in self-pity and fault-finding rather than engage in more creative problem-solving. The self's alternative to being at effect is being at cause. I'll share a personal example here. My daughter, Ari, is an actress. And when the coronavirus situation struck, she had just made her off-Broadway debut. And as a result, her show was closed. So would she deal with this situation by being at effect, cursing her miserable karma? Or could she shift to being at cause, actively taking care of herself and preparing for the next steps in her career? Like most of us, she did a bit of both. First, she experienced a period of mourning for what had been lost, not just in terms of her own career, but in terms of the suffering of other cast members, the producers, the stagehands, and so on. Then she shifted into a more active recovery mode, staying in touch with friends and cast members via the internet, watching and rewatching some of her favorite theater performances, movies, and TV programs, in particular, and oddly enough, old reruns of The Love Boat. That's a whole other conversation. And creating an online video with a friend ranking the 50 best musicals that have won the Best Musical Tony Awards. And if you're interested, message me, I'll send you the link. Again, I'm not proposing that those first mind-dominated at-effect stages should be skipped or overlooked. Why not take advantage of such a perfect opportunity to feel sorry for ourselves? However, recognizing that self-pity is only a part of the story prepares us to adopt a broader perspective, especially one that includes finding opportunities to be of service to others. So for example, a ballerina whose dance company had closed for the rest of the season due to the pandemic went back to her hometown, and after a few weeks of feeling lost, she found a way to keep in touch with the world of dance by providing online classes for students at the ballet school where she herself had trained. A third and final mind-self contrast that I think might prove useful in helping you think about how you're coping during the pandemic is something that I'll call avoidance versus mastery. So it's useful to distinguish between problem-solving strategies that rely on avoidance, which is the mind's preference, and those that have mastery as the goal, which is the self's penchant. From the mind's point of view, why take unnecessary risks? Stay away from anything threatening, whether the threat is physical or psychological, right? Why ask for a favor and risk rejection? This strategy can prevail in the most trivial situations and the most profound. Years ago, a very skilled tennis player gave up the sport because he realized he might not make it to the city finals. So why play if you might lose? There was a time in the history of medicine when research on syphilis was stymied because people were unwilling to utter the word or acknowledge the scope of the problem. The mind's impulse to avoid means minimizing, discounting, and distracting as much as possible. Consistent with the mind's suppressive tendencies, many people have denied being upset by the pandemic, or at the very least, they've been annoyed with themselves for feeling upset and overwhelmed. They've pointed to media messages telling them to take their minds off the situation, to be resilient, to be productive, to be creative. And from the context-centered perspective, the problem here is that this omits step one, right? A full recognition of the mind at work. And so I encourage you all to celebrate your minds as magnificent instruments of protection, always on the job and cleverly inventing vivid scenarios of doom and gloom. And here's the paradox. The more credit you give to your mind for its tireless vigilance, the more that you let it be, the more space there is for the self to be heard. So let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's allot time for self-indulgence and self-pity before moving on to the more wholesome projects and acts of good cheer. This counterintuitive approach, where we notice the mind before we move on to the self, is ultimately the more efficient path. Further, while we're in the mind mode, I think strong feelings can be expressed, right? The full gamut from anger and shock to fear and sadness. To quote a Dylan Thomas line somewhat out of context, do not go gentle into that good night. Give the mind a chance to do its worst. The pandemic is one of those occasions it has been waiting for, when some of its dire warnings actually have a firmer basis in real-world concerns than usual. Let me share a last example here, one that many of you can relate to. A college professor found herself feeling a range of powerful emotions after her university moved classes online and sent faculty and students home for the rest of the semester. She was flooded with a mix of grief and rage, which she branded excessive and not normal. A colleague of mine reassured her that this was indeed normal and was not only to be expected, but applauded. All systems were a go. Everything was working just fine. My colleague encouraged her to spend a few hours without allowing any hopeful or optimistic thoughts to spoil her pity party. And the next time he spoke to her, a few days later, she laughed and admitted that she'd had trouble keeping more positive thoughts from making an appearance. So a few concluding thoughts. The media is filled with news coverage of how the coronavirus pandemic has brought out the best and worst in people. I agree, and I see this as reflecting our minds and selves in action. For every unscrupulous vendor engaged in price gouging, there were doctors and nurses making astonishing sacrifices to care for those who were ill. For every COVIDiot refusing to practice social distancing because it interfered with the mind's desire for immediate gratification, there were people staying home for the greater good, even though it meant long-term separation from their loved ones. For every politician playing mind games with the public by exploiting fears and stoking anger about our current predicament, there were others who have provided comfort and aid. The thing to remember is that all of us vacillate between the context of mind and self. So none of us are above our minds occasionally getting the best of us. It happens, and we should not expect otherwise or kick ourselves when it does. By encouraging people to appreciate the mind and be aware of how it works, we can help them strengthen the self and operate from it more readily, even during distressing periods that feed the mind's worst impulses, such as the one we find ourselves in right now. It's helpful to remember that the mind's reactions are transient and forever changing. At the end of the darkly comic and touching movie Jojo Rabbit, which takes place in Nazi Germany, which, as our earlier presentation made clear and reminded us, it was another challenging period in recent history. But at the end of Jojo Rabbit, there's a quote from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror, just keep going. No feeling is final. Perhaps this can serve as a mantra for all of us during these arduous and unsettling times. Thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to the discussion period.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's another wonderful presentation. I just want to kind of tie all the presentations together. It's really interesting because, like I mentioned earlier, when we were talking, I teach a class on memory, and I taught it last spring semester. And one of the books that we read actually ties into these three presentations, because one of the things they're talking about is loss, the loss of future. The author, Jorge Semprún, he's a survivor of Buchenwald. And so he has a little, a series of books that he talks about that experience. And one of the things that he says in one of his autobiographies is that he chose life over writing because, you know, the idea of going back to the experience and what we like these flashbacks going forward. So he was trying to give meaning to his present self when there's flashbacks going back to the camps and the experience he lived in. And, you know, one of the things that I resonates here between all three panels is this idea of fear of the future, what has been lost, the idea of the event, you know, how do we understand this event and our current state? That's one of the things that I thought it was interesting. And one of the things that we have is this idea of the survival narrative, which is kind of like the, you know, the presentation that we heard also about from Carla about how students are writing and expressing their feelings and how they're coping with it. And your presentation is interesting on how that writing or coping helps us to understand what's going on. So my question is basically, what do you guys think about this idea of what has been lost, and how does the future space and memory play into all these ideas? So if anyone.
I mean, I think different things obviously have been lost for different people. And I think keeping with the idea of, making meaning out of this, right? People have to make meaning out of this experience, and the meanings that they create, will end up having an influence on how they end up experiencing things. And of course, that's often a difficult process. And so, I mean, all change is disruptive, right? Even good changes that we like are disruptive. Here's change that nobody wanted, that's disruptive. And I'm guessing that it violated for a lot of people their sense that somehow we lived in a time where bad things didn't happen in the same way they somehow did in the past. I got a little of that from Christopher's presentation, right? That this sort of sense of, the sort of things that my grandmother lived through somehow are fundamentally different. Like, we're past those sorts of times. That kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. And I think this has sort of awakened people to the fact that life is more fragile than perhaps we've somehow told ourselves. And again, that realization in and of itself, depending on how we make meaning out of it, I think can have repercussions for how we move forward and live our lives.
Yeah, I thought a lot as Carla was speaking about, the impact that this is having on our students. And, one thought that occurred to me a lot is that, for me, I don't feel a sense of, a lost year having occurred. I've still been able to write. I've spent time with my family. There's certain people I haven't been able to see, trips I wasn't able to go on, things like that. But, I don't feel as if, possibilities, doors closed, things like that, right? Very often, in the same way that I would, I think, it was, it all happening to me when I was 18 or 20 years old, right? When all those doors are just opening. And I think that's, to some degree, that's why I've tended to focus, my my feelings a little bit more on my children, because, for them, they're much younger, but they're, for instance, I realized the last time I had seen my parents was Christmas of 2019. And then as we came around to the sort of the anniversary, and it was going to be, Christmas of 2020, it was very sad to realize that it had been a full year since we'd seen them. And then but it was really much more upsetting actually when I realized as they started coming up on their birthdays again in February and April, because I realized they missed an entire year of their lives. You know, they haven't seen my daughter since she was 2, and now she's 4, which is such a, I mean, I can't even remember when she was 2. And haven't seen my son since he was 6. And that feels like such a bigger loss to me in a way, because I could, I can measure it, and their development is happens on such a bigger scale over the course of that year. Whereas again, for me, the difference between being the age I was before it started and the age I will be when it's over doesn't seem like such a significant leap. I don't know.
Yeah, I will just tack on to that. I've never felt as grateful to be middle-aged as I have throughout this. It's kind of the sweet spot for this particular, ongoing disaster, because I do feel like there's time ahead of me to get back to some semblance of a new normal. I do feel like I haven't missed things, that where there is that kind of critical periods or that time sensitivity. So, let's hear it for middle age, but let's also be even more empathetic for the people, both at the younger and the older ends of the lifespan.
So if anyone has questions, we can, proceed. I don't see any right now, but I just find it interesting because one of the things that you guys talk about, and I'll just interject here while we're waiting for some questions, is the idea of, again, how do we react to the event and how do we plan for the future? Because every step that we do is with this idea of contemplating what's my next step. And when you have this idea of a comfort zone, even though is right about this idea that since 9/11 nothing has been very normal, with all the school shootings and all this violence that we see, it makes you wonder how these generations are thinking about it. So I guess my point is kind of like this idea: how do we move forward when at this moment you're living an experience, you have lost experience, and you start thinking to yourself, well, why does it matter? Like, what's going to happen next? You just kind of regress to a very defensive system, which is interesting because that's what I read in all this testimonies that I do for my classes. I have authors that were children during the Spanish Civil War that, they went to a different type of literature, escapismo. They go into the fantasy world of, the Disney characters like Cinderella, and how the mind regresses, and it'd be interesting to see if there's some kind of parallel there. So I don't know, do you guys have any other questions? I don't see a lot of questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll just sort of respond to what you were saying, Isidoro, in terms of, so one, framing this and thinking about your experience in terms of mind and self, right? The mind wants to keep you safe, and it wants to win or at least not lose, but it has no awareness or concern about whether you're happy, right? So sometimes when we're in that kind of defensive place, we're focused on those very narrow range of things. I got to keep myself safe. I've got to hoard as much toilet paper as I can because I might need that. It's not about being happy, right? The self sort of has a bigger view, and so the mind always wants to hoard, protect, keep you safe, without any concern about how satisfying that is.
Right.
And I know I can think of times during the year where I've sort of felt the need to be safe and at my, the expense of my own sort of happiness and satisfaction with things. On the other hand, the mind is also useful. Sometimes those things are important. So I think, yeah, helping people to recognize and balance those things can be particularly useful during these times.
I mean, it's interesting to see because I teach in person on campus, and you have this idea of the constant reminder, social distancing,
Yes.
hand sanitizers, the mask, and you see how students are reacting to that too. They're just everything becomes kind of like a danger to them. Like you yourself are a danger to others. So that also has to be very resonating. That all of a sudden you have like an innocent visit to someone, let's say my mother that has Parkinson's, and then she becomes ill because of that visit, right? So that also has a kind of like a very serious effect.
And I'd be curious, and Carla probably can speak to this much better than I can, but one of the things that seems to me generationally is very different, like from my kids. My kids are in their early 20s, versus when I was growing up, in a way is almost like a perfect storm to make the pandemic even that much scarier, which is that it seemed like my generation of parents were more protective with our kids in a lot of ways. We shielded them from a lot of things. We structured their lives much more so. Whereas I was sent out, hey, go play in the street. There was never any unstructured activity. Everything was always, for my kids, you have ballet at 4 o'clock and then you do homework at 5 o'clock. And, this is how it is. And so there was sort of built into a lot of their upbringing, unintentionally, I think, a lot of fearfulness about a lot of things. And now all of a sudden you have something, since the mind knows no proportion, right? Now you have a pandemic that really is a scary, dangerous thing. And I sometimes, have felt like the growing up process is slower because people haven't had as much opportunity to kind of stumble and make mistakes and encounter things that are what they were told are dangerous or scary, but are actually just developmental pitfalls and pratfalls that you have to take in order to grow up. I suspect that that's made it more difficult for many kids who are, college age and younger, but I don't know if that fits with your experience, Carla.
Yeah, that's definitely something I found in some of the research that I did as well. I mean, I have a whole chapter on sort of parenting post 9/11, when not only had the attack actually occurred, but there was all the security theater around it that was largely used to justify going to the post 9/11 wars, et cetera. So I think for parents raising this generation of what are now children and emerging adults, it was absolutely done in a very, an environment where there was an awareness of these threats. Not that there wasn't awareness of threats like polio, parents had awareness in the past for sure. But also, I think we also need to really factor in the concept of the digital tether with cell phones, of parents being constantly in touch with kids throughout adolescence and even into college. It used to be you went off to school and you didn't have any contact with your parents for 8 hours at a stretch. And so you had to learn to kind of fight your own battles and figure things out for yourself. And I think a lot of young people today, and it's kind of gone both directions. I mean, I think that has led to a lot of these accusations of kids today not being independent, but in some ways it's because their parents haven't allowed them to be. But also just
Have you experienced? Have you had any situations now, especially now while we're doing office hours remotely, of parents trying to kind of sit in on the office hour appointments of the students?
I have not experienced that.
I've had it, and I've had other faculty come to me with like, how do I handle this? What do I do? How do I set boundaries with these parents?
Right. I have a question that might tie into this, where you guys talking about parents, and so the question is, as a middle-aged person looking at young adults, I see that the things I identify as extraordinary stresses are just normal for them. I am not surprised how resilient they are, given that they have not known otherwise. Do you have comments about this? And just to we didn't grow up with school shootings, for example. So what do you guys think about that?
I'll jump in on that one because this is something I've asked students about specifically. And I've had some really interesting sort of writings about this, where at the beginning of the paragraph, they'll say, well, the lockdown drills were just perfectly routine. It was for them the equivalent of a fire drill for older generations. So they didn't even think about it. But on the other hand, they'll then in the next sentence say, yet I was always terrified of school shootings and very aware that this was a real thing that could happen to us. So it's this very kind of skewed perception of threats. And then of course, we get all of the availability heuristic stuffs of, even though these events like a mass shooting are incredibly rare, when they do happen, they, not surprisingly, get so much media attention that really distorts people's understanding of how likely these events actually are. So that, and now social media, of course, is a factor in everything, my perspective.
I mean, and in some ways, again, the mind likes to win and make comparisons. And in some ways, I find myself sort of saying, well, every generation has different challenges, right? And so I remember, the nuclear fallout drills when I was in first grade. I was like, why are we all hiding under our desks? And what are we doing? Why are we listening on the floor? What's going on? I know this is scary, but I don't understand what's going on. I know that I don't know what the research on this is, but it seemed to me just anecdotally from my kids, and again, it was a different school district in a different part of the state, but there was a lot more attention in my kids' schooling to not allowing bullying compared to what I recall growing up in school, where it was just like, let them work it out. They'll punch each other and torture each other and call each other nasty names, and and they'll work it out. And which I don't think was necessarily so great. I know sometimes people are like, no, we need to go back to that. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Having been on the receiving end of some of that, I wouldn't want my kids to have to go back to that.
A lot of therapy sessions for those experiences.
Yeah.
So
And
I have another question here. Just to, we look at Professor Jansma's grandmother as so resilient, but what happened to her was normal for her. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just noticing that. I just wanted to say quickly first to Jonathan that my son's school, one interesting aspect of him doing remote school now sometimes is I get to listen to what he's learning about, which I wouldn't normally. It's sort of the similar, I guess, the reverse of the parents coming into your office hours. But I try very hard not to like hover around him unless he needs help. But they start off the school day with these like mood meters. I don't know if you've run into these, but they're like basically a graphical representation, and every kid has to go and point to where they feel they are on the mood meter. And I've been noticing this year that they've sort of made that a big part of their dialogue and talking about how everybody's feeling and why and I went similar to the bullying, right? I can't remember anybody ever asking me that when I was growing up, like, how are you feeling today? And where would you put your emotions on this chart? And, I do wonder if it eventually leads to, like a resilience of a sort, or at least or that part, I hope leads to a more, I don't know, being a little bit more in touch with their emotions, I suppose. But to get back to the other question about my grandmother, and resilience. Yeah, it is interesting when I talk to her because I can't help when I'm talking to her being sort of astounded by what she survived, and how to me it sounds so insane and so different from obviously what I would have known as an 8-year-old. And she does have that exact sort of attitude about it, which was well, this is just what was happening and everybody did it. And everyone, it was the only world I knew, and so everyone else was also dealing with all these problems. I didn't have a sense that there was any other way that you were supposed to be at 8. I imagine that's going to be a similar thing for my own children. When they get older, right? They sort of be able to hopefully look back on this from a distance and realize that they did get through something that was pretty extraordinary, but for right now, I don't think it seems like they are winning a battle every day. I think they just see it as oh yeah, I forgot to put my mask on. I have to sit. My son, they can only sit 2 together at a cafeteria table, so it's become a big part of his life about who he happens to be paired with to sit with at lunch, and it's just all very normal now. Yeah.
So I think we're getting to almost 6:30. I want to thank you all for accepting our invitation to be in the panel. I think it was very useful. And look forward to an email from me so I can invite you to my class next. Because this is actually very well, you know, your I think it's great what you guys have done, and all the research you guys are doing is very informative. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Despina, for organizing
Yeah,
everything.
good night, everybody.
Yeah, good night. Thanks for coming and listening.
Yep. Take care.